Good evening. It's around 10 o'clock in England. Thanks for joining us all. And tonight we have Dr. J. Smith from the States. He's joining us in the afternoon around 5 o'clock in his time. And we will be talking about Quran. Jay?
Hello. Hi there. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see you and I can hear you, and I don't know if YouTube people can see you and hear you. Can you give me permission to be recorded in this live stream?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Feel free to.
Okay, thank you. So our topic for tonight, those of you who are joining us in the chat about Quran, so please keep your questions, conversation, chats on the topic. If you do have any question, or if you want to make a comment to get my attention or Jay's attention, please put @ sign in front of DCCI Ministries, so that will get my attention. I hope I won't miss. Usually after the live streams, I get emails that I missed to read your questions or comments. But I'm usually intentional to look at it. And good thing is we are not all perfect. Therefore, sometimes we do miss it because we are not perfect. Please also keep your comments and chat conversations in a respectful manner. And let me pass on Jay. Jay?
Yeah.
How have you been?
Well, we've been rather hot here. I should hear that you guys are having the same heat wave, similar to what we've got here. That's something to be unexpected. I've got my, by the way, is that too loud? I can turn it off.
I think I'm okay with it.
That's my air conditioner. But if it's too loud, let me know. I'll just turn it off.
Okay, it's fine for now. So how have you been besides being hot?
Well, it's been terrific because we're getting an awful lot of feedback from the material that we've been putting up, Hatun. We're getting feedback specifically on what you and I did at 2 months ago at Speaker's Corner on the 2020 corrections from Dan Brubaker's book. And it's been fascinating that we need to do a live stream just on the rebuttals by the Muslims. There have been about 3 or 4 good rebuttals by Yusuf Qadri and also by Ijazi Ahmed and also by Mansour Ahmed. We need to go back and we need to show that every one of these can be, we need to shut down every one of these criticisms, because many of them, they still don't understand what we're talking about. They still think we're talking about the Qira'at in the Ahruf. They have no idea what they're up against. But that's for another time, that's for another day. Nonetheless.
One of the things I struggle to understand is when you give people opportunity to have a proper conversation about it, everyone runs away and no one wants to talk about it. But people feel very comfortable to just get behind the camera while there is no one can reply you, and then you just like make your statements and move on. That's just wrong, but that's what people do. Anyway.
There's 3 of us who are now writing responses to every one of those major comments. 2 of them are Al-Fadi and myself. So we're probably going to finish up. We're going to have these finished by next week. If we could have a live stream where you and I just go through each one of these and just actually respond to each one of these criticisms to show how stupid and how really how simplistic these criticisms are of what we know as consonantal variants, that they're not getting it. And many of them, I think, is because they don't understand Arabic. It would be great if you and I could unpack it, help people understand it, so if they hear these criticisms, they can respond to it. But that's not for today. That's not what we're going to be talking about today.
All right. So we have eternal word of Allah, which has been historically corrupted. But tonight we want to look at different side of eternal word of Allah. We want to look at the Quran and the chapters or the verses or the stories within the Quran. Jay, I think you need to make some stuff like silent from your computer.
Yeah, that's just a thing that's coming in. But if I make a silent, then I can't hear you. So either way, either I put the volume down and I can't hear you, or I put the volume up and I hear, it's just, it'll be the only time that comes through. It's just a new software that's been upgraded. They're telling me they want to upgrade my software.
Yeah, that's when they say men always have excuses.
Okay, God bless you. Let's go ahead and let's get into this material.
So we will be looking at the source criticism of the Quran. Jay, can you just summarize for us what did I mean, since you've got better English than me?
Well, what you do is when you look at the Quran, and all of you do, if you have a Quran, if not get a Quran, but I'm sure many of you who are watching are Muslims, so you will have your own Qurans. When you look at and you read the stories, specifically the stories about characters that we have in the Bible, in this book here. So when you look at the two books, you will see there are stories that have the same name. There are stories about Abraham in this book. There are stories about Abraham in this book. Chapter 21, for instance, talks about Abraham. But when you look at the two stories, they do not parallel. They're completely different stories. You've got in this book, Abraham living in, well, we knew that he lived in what is today Iraq, but then he moved all the way over to Canaan, which is today Canaan, which is now Israel. So he moved across over to the west, to the east coast of the Mediterranean. And we know that he lived there, and that's where he did most of his ministry. In this book, it has him way down in Mecca, completely in the wrong place, and doing the wrong thing. And so when you start to look and do a comparison, you notice that it's not the same stories. In this book over here, you have Solomon and Sheba, that's Queen of Sheba, but you have the story of Solomon that's quite historical and actually has been supported by history. When you look at the story in chapter 27 of this book of Solomon, it's a completely different story. It doesn't make any sense. You can see that there are some historical anachronisms. So the question starts to come up, hold on a minute, how can you have two different books with the same characters saying and giving us completely different stories? This one makes sense, this one does not. Well, we're going to answer that today, and we're going to show you why. When you look at this book, when you look at the stories behind this book, the reason why they aren't the same is because the sources for the stories in this book, we know where they are. We know who wrote them. We know when they were written. The reason that they are not the same as the Bible, the much older, the much bigger, and also the much earlier book, is because they've got the wrong source. They've got the wrong story. And that's why much of the problems with the Quran concerning the biblical characters is they should have gone to this book. They should have gone to the Bible instead of going to these other sources.
Okay, I'm just struggling to understand something. Quran is the eternal word of Allah, and in every verses in the Quran, except like verse comes from angel, verse end up in the Quran with the contribution of Umar and also the satanic verses. Beside all of those verses, Quran is the only sayings of Allah. How can only sayings of Allah is not historically reliable and historically sourced from another human-made writings?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. If it is only made by men, as we're saying this book is, then it has to get its material. Remember what we talked about earlier, and when we talked about the two compilations, we know that those two compilations between Abu Bakr and Uthman, 632 and 652, we know that they are probably not at all correct. And we do know, we haven't got into this yet, but we do pretty much know that this book did not exist at all at the time of Uthman, and nor did it exist at the time of Abu Bakr. We don't have any manuscripts that really start to appear with this book until after the time of Abdul Malik. Now, when Abdul Malik created and introduced Muhammad as a prophet, remember, we don't have him introduced in any Arab source prior to 691 as a prophet. He is introduced on the Dome of the Rock by Abdul Malik. Once you have the prophet, you need to have a book. Every prophet has to have a revelation. And that's what it looks like. It was from that time, from the time of Abdul Malik. He ruled from 685 to 705. From 685 to 705, from that time, they needed to get the book. So what do, Hatu? Well, the first thing they do is they have to borrow from many different places. And that's why, as you said last week, when we talked about how the Quran was borrowed, you You have a codex that was very popular in Damascus, in Syria, that was the Codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b. You have another codex that became very popular in Basra, which is the Codex of Abu Musa. You have another codex, another complete different Quran, which became very popular in Baghdad, which was the Codex of, or the compilation of Ibn Musa. And then you have Zayd ibn's codex, the one that the Muslims claim is this one right here, that became popular in Medina. They do not agree. There are about 15,000 differences that Arthur Jeffrey found between those four, what we call metropolitan codices. And the reason why is because they're borrowing. When you're borrowing, you need to quickly fill up this book. You need to have a book that's quick because you've already appointed the apostle, the prophet in this case. Since they borrowed, they weren't discriminatory as to what they borrowed. And in fact, what they borrowed was what was available to them. And the only thing that was available to them, Hatun, at this time, were the stories that were in the vernacular that were being regurgitated by the Jews that they were having contact with. And what were the Jews they were having contact with? Well, the Jews they were having contact with were really the Jews that were in Arabia, not Arabia, sorry, let's take that back. The Jews that they came across in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Basra, in these big cities, these large cities that were now controlled by the Arabs, they came across and they already had contact with these Jews. And these Jews were reiterating a lot of what we call apocryphal writings. Many of them are folk tales. Many of them were children's bedtime tales. These were the things that they were speaking out loud, and they were using them for entertainment. The Arabs heard these stories. The Arabs could not discriminate as to which were real and which were not, because remember, the Arabs did not have a scripture yet. They didn't have any scripture. That's very clear. They have no prophetic line. That's very clear. So they hear these Jews, and they realize the Jews and the Christians as well, but mainly the Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham, as they trace their lineage back to Abraham, one through Isaac, the Jews, and one through Ishmael, the Arabs. Since they had contact with these Jews, and these Jews both traced their lineage back to Abraham, they then decided to borrow these stories from the Jews. The problem is they made a critical mistake. And the critical mistake is this: they didn't go to the original scriptures of the Jews. They didn't go to the scriptures the Jews had. They just went to these oral traditions. These oral traditions that were being passed down, many of them in what they call, even around the campfire, where you have traders, you have caravans who are coming, and they would hear these stories the Jews were relating. These were great storytellers, the Qusas, they called them. And these storytellers are reiterating biblical characters, but they were putting different stories to these biblical characters, and many of the stories they were putting to were nothing more than folk tales for the children, for their own children. Now, the Jews had been discriminatory. The Jews knew that these were part of what we know as the Talmud or the Mishnah. The Talmud or the Mishnah are nothing more than reiterates stories that were reiterated by clerics, but never ever as gospel truth. These were never considered to be authoritative. They were never considered to be along the same lines as the canonical text. The canonical text that we have here, and this is the canonical text we have here, the Old Testament, all 36 books, were well known. But remember, the Jews that they came across, that the Arabs came across, had fled from Israel. They had fled way back in the 1st century, after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. They fled into the diaspora, and as they fled, they took their scrolls with them. The scrolls contained their canonical scripture, their scripture text. These scrolls they protected. These scrolls they did not give to anybody else. These scrolls were their scrolls. This was their tradition. This was their identity. And the Jews were very careful not to share that identity with anybody else. That's why, in some ways, the Jews can be, even today, there has been much criticism of the Jews for doing that. Nonetheless, the Arabs, therefore, would not have had access to those scrolls. And those scrolls were never, ever translated into the vernacular. They were always retained in Hebrew. They were kept in Hebrew, and they were kept in, they were protected by the rabbis. And the rabbis were very clear that no one else could read them but other Jews, in fact, but themselves. That's why for 600 years, the Jews never allowed anybody to read these stories from the original text. What we now know is that the Hebrew Bible that we have here, this is the Bible here, the Hebrew part, the Old Testament part, the 36 books that the Jews follow, and they still follow today, was not translated into Arabic until the 8th century. Since it was not translated until the 8th century, remember, we're talking about the late 7th and early 8th century for this book. Since that is the case, you can see that the Arabs, as they were trying to put this book together, as they were trying to amalgamate this book together, since they did not have the original text, they did not have the Hebrew text, nor did they have the Hebrew translated into a language they could understand. It had not yet been translated to Arabic. The only thing they had access to, the only stories they had access to Abraham and to Moses and to Solomon and Adam and Eve, these stories are the apocryphal accounts. These are the ones from the Targums and the Mishnahs, which Jews knew were not the real stories. They always knew it. In some ways, you could almost imagine that they were laughing behind their backs, because the Jews knew that what the Arabs were using and inculcating and then writing out and then sending out and also putting into their own scriptures were the wrong stories. They were not from God. They were not historical. They were never considered to be authoritative. No Jew would ever believe that this is what Abraham did when we look at Surah 21, or what Solomon did when we look at Surah 27, or what Cain and Abel did when we look at Surah 5. And so that's why we need to go back to Surah 5. We need to go back to Surah 21. We need to go back to Surah 27. Look at those stories and then compare it with the real stories that we have in the real text, which is the Old Testament, which has been preserved for us. And that's why we always go back to this book, because this book, the stories in this book are correct. The stories in this book are not correct. They just went to the wrong source.
Okay, so let me just unpack that, or just like let me put the level I can understand. Quran is the eternal word of Allah, contains the sayings of Allah. And when we read the Quran, we see Quran has a lot of respect to the Bible and gives authority to the Bible. And it is there to confirm the Bible. Therefore, when we read the stories from the Quran, stories about Abraham, stories about from the Old Testament as well as from the New Testament, we should see those stories in the same line as the confirmation of the stories which we read from the Old Testament and New Testament. But now what you are telling me, Allah with all of his wisdom, or the author of the Quran, simply gives us the stories which actually people were just telling one another as around the campfire. Is that correct summary what you are telling me, Jane?
Very good summary, Hatu. You've got it on the nail. You speak much more eloquently than I do. Thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. I'm receiving a couple of messages that people have not received the notification for the live stream. I don't know why. I haven't done anything differently, but
I didn't receive notification until about 20 minutes ago. I didn't even know that we were having this live stream. So forgive me. That's quite normal. I didn't even know that until you actually texted me on my phone and said, "Are you ready?" And I had to really jump and really put this together. So we're doing this, as we say in English, by the seat of our pants. Excuse both me and those others who didn't know that, Hatun. It's our fault.
No. So when I go live, YouTube's supposed to send a message to the people's mailbox to say that we will have live stream, or live stream is started. So apparently people did not get that notification. So it has nothing to do that you didn't remember, you were bad with your admin skills, or I was bad with my admin skills. It has something to do with YouTube, and I don't know why that happened. But we do have little bit funny relationship between DCCI and YouTube. So at this stage, I can't do much about it. So
you may want to tell people that in the last live stream you had, you were cut off. So this may happen with this one as well.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
Yeah, just watch out for that. Be careful. I don't know why YouTube didn't send notification, but God is in charge. So let's go back to the stories which Allah's supposed to give it to us from the Quran as the confirmation of the Bible or the similar stories from the Bible. Have you got any example that you can give it to me, Jay?
Yeah, let me put this one up right now, and I'll see if I can do a little better than I did last week. I did terrible last week, but let's go ahead and put it up. Here's a story. Here's a story that I want you to look at. Is it on your screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yes, it is.
Okay, here it is. Okay, chapter 5, verse 31 of the Quran is the story of Cain and Abel and the raven. In Surah, then it says, Then Allah sent a raven who scratched the ground to show him how to hide the shame of his brother. Woe is me, said he. Was I not even able to be as this raven and to hide the shame of my brother? Then he became full of regrets. So here you have Cain, having killed his brother, doesn't know what to do with the body of his brother, sees a raven who is burying its partner, and he uses that example to then bury his brother. Now, that story is not in the Bible at all. We don't see any reference for that anywhere in the Old Testament. But we do have almost the exact same story in the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, which was written in the 2nd century, which says, Adam and Eve, sitting by the corpse, wept, not knowing what to do, for they had as yet no knowledge of burial. A raven came up, took the dead body of its fellow, and having scratched at the earth, buried it thus before their eyes. Adam said, Let us follow the example of the raven. So taking up Abel's body, buried it at once. So here you have almost the exact same story, though in the Targum, it's with Adam and Eve. In the Quran, it's with Cain. But
Okay.
this is the exact same story. So you can see that it looks like that this is where they borrowed it from.
Okay, let me just understand this, Jay. So it's going to be slow because sometimes I struggle to understand basics. So Quran is the word of God, and the verses in the Quran is the sayings of Allah. Quran is the speech of Allah. The verses in it is the sayings of Allah. And Quran is there to confirm the Bible. But now we have Surah 5 verse 31 of the Quran comes from something which is identified as not the word of God.
Absolutely. This is really nothing more than an apocryphal account written in the 2nd century by a fellow named Jonathan ben Uzziah. You can see it. You can go into libraries and see that writing. It's available today. This is nothing new. It's the Jews know all about it. And the fact that it was written in the 2nd century AD, look at the date. This is after the New Testament was already canonized. This is long after the Old Testament's been canonized. So this is at the time after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD in the 1st century. And it was this Targum that was then passed down by different by different Jewish community that finds its way into the Quran as a source for this story in chapter 5, verse 31. But it gets better than that, because then look at the next verse that follows it, verse 32. You want to go to that one?
Yeah.
Okay, let me share this one with you. Here's verse 32. And this one shows that there's a real problem here, because then that verse, which verse is found in chapter 5, verse 31. Then we come to this verse, which is the next verse that follows it. On that account, it says in chapter 5, verse 32. So it's referring to verse 31. On that account, referring to Cain killing his brother and then following the example of the raven who's to bury his brother. On that account, it says, we ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless it be for the murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of a whole people. Now, that's a very well-known verse. Everybody quotes that. Obama quotes that. I've had this over and over again when many of the pundits, many of your Western leaders like to quote this verse, because this seems to show that Islam is a religion of peace, right?
Yeah, you mean pieces, but that's different topic.
Okay, until you go back to the where this is found. This is not found in the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. What's interesting is this is found in the Mishnah Sanhedrin. Now, what is the Mishnah Sanhedrin? Well, let me just go ahead and bring this up so you can see it better. Can you see that better now? The Mishnah Sanhedrin is a much later account. Remember, the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah was written in the 2nd century. In the 5th century, a scribe was copying out the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, the story of Cain and the raven. And as he was writing and copying it out, in the margin, he wrote with his own pen this reference to he who kills. He says this, we find it said in the case of Cain, he just writes out in the margin, he who takes the blood of one, it's if he takes the blood of all. But he who saves the blood of one, it's if he saves the blood of all. Basically, he's just thinking out loud about the blood of Abel in the previous verse. That is left in the margin until the 5th century, when the Mishnah Sanhedrin was then put together. When the Mishnah Sanhedrin was put together, they take the story of Jonathan ben Uzziah from Surah 5, which is now today Surah 5, Ayah 31, and then they take they take also this redemption analysis on the blood of Abel from the scribe writing in the 5th century, early 5th century, and they incorporate it into the same story. So then you get Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 4, verse 5, which says, we find it said in the case of Cain, who murdered his brother, the voice of thy brother's blood crieth out. It does not say if he had blood in the singular, but bloods in the plural. Thou was created single in order to show that to him who kills a single individual, it should be reckoned that he has slain the whole race. But to him who has preserved the life of a single individual, it is counted that he has preserved the whole race. So here you have that same redemption analysis on the blood of Abel, written in the late 5th century in Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 4, verse 5, that it's incorporated into Surah 5, Ayah 32. Now stop and think. Is that legitimate, or is that anything to do with Muslims today? There are two problems. Can you see the two problems, Hatun?
I can see lots of problems. But
okay, go ahead. Start telling me what you think, because to me, this is hugely significant.
So this is for the children of Israel, not for the Muslims.
Okay, how do you know that?
Because there is like huge verse says, for the children of Israel.
That's right. So it's right there, right at the beginning of the verse. Oh, for the children of Israel. So this has nothing to do with you and me. This has nothing to do with Muslims. This has only to do with Jews, right?
Yeah.
And then what else is the problem here? Is this a story that is a universal story, or is it referring to the incident that happens earlier on the murder of Abel by Cain?
So author of the Quran, whoever that person was, or the person who claims to receive this revelation from Allah, clearly did not have any knowledge on what is identified as the inspired word of God.
Yes, and so you can see here, go back and look at the Mishnah Sanhedrin in case of Cain who murdered his brother. So this is referring to the incident about Cain and Abel. That's why the blood analogy, the fact that you kill a single individual, you kill the whole race. You, Cain, that have killed Abel, this is going to have repercussions for all of us Jews. But if you save the life of one, you save all that has repercussions for us Jews the other way. So this has nothing to do with Muslims. It has nothing to do with you and me today. It is not a universal application. Even when the Mishnah Sanhedrin was written, it was written as an analogy about the blood of Abel by Cain. This was only for that incident and that incident alone. And it was for only the Jews. Can you see, coming and going, the Quran's got it wrong.
So this is another opportunity for those of you who are watching and Muslims. Please explain why you do have stories in the Quran as the part of eternal word of Allah, which has been identified as not the inspired word of God according to Christian scripture. Can you please explain to us how come all-knowing, all-powerful Allah failed to remember what was in the previous scripture which Quran came to confirm? Why would Allah, who is all wise and all knowing, put the stories in the Quran, which was going around as the campfire stories. I love to know, actually. So this live stream gives you opportunity to simply explain to us. You can do that through putting add sign in front of DCCI ministries. That will get our attention, so we can hear what you are trying to, how you are trying to defend.
Okay, you want to go to another example?
Yeah, I love to actually see about the Abraham one, Surah 21.
Okay, here we have Surah 21, and you can see it there. I now have it up on the slide. Abraham and the Kaaba. He is in the Kaaba. So this means he is in Mecca, supposedly. This is what Muslims are saying today. We now know from Dan Gibson's research that there was no Mecca. There was no Kaaba that early. Certainly not in 1900 BC. That's when Abraham lived. So you've got a number of historical problems, but let's just go back to this reference. Now, this is a story. I won't give the whole story. It'll take too long. But basically what happens is that Abraham is disturbed by all these idols in the Kaaba. He's there living in Mecca. What he's doing in Mecca, I don't know. I thought he lived 600 miles further north. But here he is. He's in Mecca. Everybody seems to be living in Mecca. So Abraham's there. In the middle of the night, he goes into the Kaaba. He takes a large idol and he smashes all the smaller idols. The next morning, the people see that. They get really angry and they grab Abraham and they put him into a fiery pit, after which Abraham then is released. Miraculously, he walks out unscathed. Now, stop and think. Is that story in our Bible, Hatun?
No, I don't think that even historically reliable, since in the British Museum we've got where Abraham came from, and through Bible we can chase which cities Abraham stopped and traveled when he left Earth to go to the Promised Land.
There you go. So historically, Abraham, at least the biblical context, we've got Abraham in the right city, doing the right thing at the right time. We even know that the customs that he did that are found in the Genesis account about him are exactly correct because of the Nuzi and the Mari tablets, which have now been discovered from the same time period Abraham lived and from the same area Abraham lived. So the Bible has got it correct on almost every category historically. Nonetheless, here's a real problem. If Abraham is thrown into a fiery pit, since that's not in the biblical account, where does that story come from? Who else was thrown into a fiery pit?
Again, another campfire stories.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yep.
They've got the wrong story. Whoever wrote the Quranic account had no idea of who actually was in a fiery pit. Abraham never was any fire, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. So it looks like whoever wrote the Quran did not know his stories correct, put Abraham in this story, got the wrong person at the wrong place, doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, should have gone back to the Bible, because if he'd gone back to the Bible, to the Genesis account, he would see that Abraham never was in Mecca, never was thrown into fiery pit, never went to the Kaaba, and never broke any idols. There's no reference anywhere in the biblical context where that happens. So where did this story come from?
So Quran gives us the story which took place approximately 1,400 years after Abraham, and in a different location by different people.
Okay, which is fascinating. Now, when you go back to the Midrash Rabbah, when you go back, you can see where the source is for this. This is the Midrash Rabbah, 2nd century Jewish account. In this account, Abraham breaks all the idols except the biggest one. His father and the others challenging him on this, and with an added bit of humor, which is missing in the Quranic account, Abraham responds by saying that he had given the biggest idol an ox for all the idols to eat. But because the smaller idols went ahead and ate it, they thus did not show respect. The bigger idol consequently smashed the smaller idols. The enraged father did not believe Abraham's account, and so took him to a man named Nimrod, who simply threw him into a fire. But God made it cool for him, and he walked out unscathed. So can you see almost the exact same story is found in the Midrash Rabbah, is now found in Surah 21. Verse 51 to 71. What's interesting is this Midrash fable that's found in the Midrash Rabbah is a Jewish fable. It's nothing more than that. Was never considered to be authoritative, was never, ever understood to be part of the canonical text. And no Jew, even today, would say that this is what happened to Abraham. So what's it doing in the Quran? looks like they borrowed the wrong story again.
I don't think this is borrowed, Jay. If you borrow something, you would get a permission, and you would put it there how it is supposed to be, instead of like just playing around with it. I would call this intellectual thief. I've got Skype call. Whoever is calling, it would be helpful if you call towards end, so we can go through them all.
Okay, now listen, I would suggest.
Yes, Jay, continue, please.
I would suggest this whole thing about borrowing and getting permission is not understood in the 7th century. Remember, that's what we do in the 21st century, and that's because when you borrow, you have to give intellectual property, and there are laws around that. But that's for modern day. Back in the 7th century or in the 8th century, when the Quran was being put together, there was no idea of borrowing this early. Of any type of regulation on borrowing. Anybody could borrow. In fact, the Quran had to be put together quickly. That's why they borrowed what was available to them. So now let's go back to another example. And this is Solomon.
I'm just going to bring up a question to you, Jay.
Yeah.
So there's a question says, Jay, do you think the Jews at the time told those stories to Muhammad to see if he was truly a prophet, to see if his Allah would inform Muhammad that those stories are false? That comes from Margina.
Now, I would answer that 2 different ways. The first problem with that is I don't believe Muhammad had anything to do with this. I don't believe Muhammad had anything to do at all with these stories. I don't think Muhammad had anything to do with the Quran, as you well know from many times I've been on live stream with you. But let's say hypothetically, let's just go back and let's assume that Muhammad is responsible for the Quran, and Muhammad is the one that received these revelations. We're already assuming that by that this is not already in heaven, has always existed. We're assuming that this has human imprint all through it. If that were so, then I would have no problem agreeing that the Jews, knowing that this man was putting this book together, the Jews did not care for Muhammad. They did not care for Arabs at all. They were not at all interested in sharing their scriptures with him. It would stand to reason that they would only share these apocryphal accounts, these folk tales, these legends. Really, these are nothing more than children's fables that they would tell in the evenings to keep children entertained. That would make sense that also if Muhammad was the author, he would have only had access to these accounts. Why then it would make sense why they appear in the Quran in chapter 5, in chapter 21, and as we're going to see next in chapter 27.
So if it was the test put together by Jews to find out if Muhammad was a prophet, we would expect Allah to step in and correct Muhammad as he was telling those kind of stories, because remember, Muhammad's God steps in every time when he makes a mistake or when he's uncomfortable when it comes to his relationship with his wives. But in somehow it seems Allah is hiding behind the doors when it comes to correcting Muhammad or correcting the author of the Quran, as they put these in uninspired stories together.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would say yes. If there's a lot of ifs there, but if those are all true, if we're going to go with those ifs, and I see you smiling because I realize that there are too many hypotheticals there. Even if that were so, then you can see that this is a huge problem. How could Allah allow these stories to get in and not the authoritative ones, not the historical ones?
So that was for the Surah 21. What do we have in Surah 27, story of Solomon?
Let's go to this one here, and this is a good one because here's the one that I wish I'd had in Sunday school. Man, oh man, this is a most entertaining of stories. In chapter 27, verse 17 to 44, Solomon. First of all, what we realize is that Solomon has quite a number of birds that it's too long to read. So let me just summarize what's there in the Quranic account. Solomon has birds that he uses and gets them ready for battle. And these birds that fly up in the air and they drop these stones on the enemy. And on the bottom of the stone is the name of the enemy they're going to kill. So here you have an example of the first Air Force ever invented by Solomon. That I didn't know. I had no idea that Solomon invented the first Air Force. He would then march them and get them ready for battle, left, right, getting them ready for battle. And then one day, as he was training his birds, he noticed that the one bird, his favorite bird, the hoopoe bird, called the hoopoe bird because it goes hoopoo, hoopoo, and that's the noise it makes. Therefore, it's given the name of the noise it makes, was missing. And so he got angry that the hoopoe bird was missing. And then suddenly he looks and he sees this bird flying in from the south, and it lands at his feet, and the bird talks to him. And Solomon responds. I had no idea that Solomon could talk to birds, but evidently he could. And the bird talks about this great country that he'd just been in, and there's this beautiful queen in the country of Sheba that he must come down and meet her. Well, Solomon's busy. He's got all kinds of state of affairs, and of course he's marching his birds. So he tells the bird to go on back down, the hoopoe bird to go and bring her up, which the bird does, flaps on back down to Sheba, lands at the feet of the queen of Sheba, and talks to the queen of Sheba. So she talks to bird. So here you have both Solomon and the Queen of Sheba able to talk to birds. I can't do that today. Can you do that today?
Just a question. Are they talking Arabic?
Aha. So in this case, it's all in Arabic. So it must be Arabic that they're speaking. I had no idea that Abraham could, or that Solomon could speak Arabic. I didn't even know Arabic existed prior to the 2nd century AD. So historically speaking, you've got a real problem here on top of that. Nonetheless, they both can talk to birds.
Okay, so let me just understand, Jay. We have birds who are getting ready for the war. Probably they have got like dress code, all those things, and then they are having nice chit-chat conversation in Arabic. Probably in Arabic, I don't know. Of course, if bird is having all those conversations and getting ready for the battles, it tells a lot about the consciousness birds have.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the comeback that Muslims will say, no, he's talking bird language, whatever bird language is. But regardless.
So Solomon knows not only Arabic, but he also knows bird language.
Well, evidently, this is what's surprising to me. I'm glad to see that he knows that he can know a language that he has yet to be invented, and also birds speak, which is something that either has been lost and never existed. But let's pick up the story again, because then the Queen of Sheba does come to Jerusalem. She comes into the throne room. Solomon's sitting on his throne. She comes in through the door. As she's walking across to meet Solomon, she looks down and she sees a pond of water. Decorative, I guess. And she has to walk through the pond, or she thinks she has to walk through the pond. So she lifts up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. And that's where the story ends in verse 44. This lake of water, as it says, tucked up her skirts, uncovering her legs. Now, why does the story end there? Well, we're going to see why when you go look at its source. Because the source for that story is the Second Targum of Esther, written in the 2nd century again. Again, another apocryphal account written by Jews, and this one, it really is for entertainment. You can tell this would be a great story, as I said earlier, that I wish I had in Sunday school. But what's fascinating, it's almost the exact same story written in the 2nd century AD, and except for the ending. In the ending of the Second Targum of Esther, when she is picking up her skirts to keep them from getting wet, she exposes her legs. She has hairy legs. When Solomon sees the hair on her legs, he cries out in surprise. That's left out of the Surah 27, ayah 17 to 44 for obvious reasons, because it's embarrassing for the Queen of Sheba. But everything else is kept in the story, proving that that is the source of the story. They borrowed it. They borrowed every part of the story that I've never heard of before. And the only thing that they have not borrowed is the very ending part, because it's so embarrassing for the Queen of Sheba.
I wouldn't say it was embarrassing for the Queen, but it was embarrassing for Islam. Remember, in Islam, people are encouraged to shave lots of places. And then suddenly they see a woman who has not shaved with hair and legs. probably they kind of, yep, that will make Allah upset. And then let's put the new principles that everyone shaves from now on. Not good at all. Putting people in a place where there is a fight for the image. Not good at all.
Well, this is something that I mean, what we're proving today and what we're showing is that almost on all of these cases, these are stories that are borrowed. Now, it's not only Jewish stories that were borrowed. There are also what we know as Christian sectarian stories, Christian sectarian accounts, Christian stories about specifically about the life of Jesus Christ.
Are you talking about the story of Mary and?
Well, what I'm going to show here is the one of Jesus who teaches his mother how to eat from the palm tree.
Yeah.
So let's look at that one here and let's share that one. You have here in Surah 19, verse 22 to 26, where Jesus has, or Isa has just been born. And so he's a brand new baby. He's a baby, but she goes to the trunk of a palm tree and she cries out in her anguish. Then Jesus, or Isa, as a brand new baby, I mean, this is probably the day he was born, responds to her from below her and says, "Grieve not, for thy Lord hath provided a rivulet beneath thee, and shake towards thyself the trunk of the palm tree, it will fall fresh ripe dates upon thee. So eat and drink and cool thine eyes." So here, this brand new baby, just been born, is speaking to her from below her and telling her to shake the palm tree so that she can eat the fresh dates. It's a date tree. The palm tree, and is able then to eat and drink. Fascinating, because that I don't see anywhere in the New Testament. I don't know Jesus ever spoke as a baby. Did you know that?
I didn't see the story in the Gospels as well. So
where does it come from?
Don't tell me all-knowing, all-wise Allah, which tells people to use the Gospel to judge and tells people Quran is the confirmation for the Bible. Fail to know the story from the Bible?
Well, you can see it is not from the Bible. It is from what we call the lost books of the Bible. Again, this is another second century. You notice these are all 2nd and 5th century. This is 2nd century. So this is after the Bible is already completed, written in the diaspora by sectarians, by this case, Christians that were in the diaspora. And they were the ones, these are mostly Gnostic writers, those who did not believe God took on bodily form. So they would already be opposed to the gospel accounts that we have in our scriptures. They would not believe that Jesus is God. And so here is fascinating. They have all these stories about his childhood, including this one, which says, "Now on the 3rd day, Mary was wearied in the desert by the heat. She asked Joseph to rest for a little under the shade of the palm tree, the branches laden with fruits of dates. Just then, the child Jesus, so baby Jesus, looked up from below and with a cheerful smile and said to the palm tree, 'Send down some fruit.' Immediately the tree bent itself, and so they ate. Then Jesus said, 'O palm tree, arise, be one of my father's trees in paradise, but with the roots upon the fountain, meat eat and all the rest.'" So here you have almost exactly the same story. In the Quranic account, actually, Jesus is telling Mary to shake the tree, and the dates fall. In the lost books of the Bible, the apocryphal writing, the sectarian writing, you have Jesus speaking to the palm tree itself to bend itself down so she can eat the fruit from its branches. That's the only difference you see between these two accounts. But you can see where the source is. It's obviously this source here, written in the 2nd century, way too late to be authoritative.
So Allah didn't want to step into the towards author of the Quran and then tell those are not the inspired word of God. Don't put them there. In somehow uninspired word of God end up in the eternal word of Allah.
Yeah. Now here's another example. This one is in chapter 3, verse 49 of the Quran, where Jesus, a messenger of children of Israel, "I have come to you with a sign from your Lord, in that I make for you out of clay, as it were, a figure of a bird, and breathe into it, and it becomes a bird by Allah's leave." Here is Jesus as a baby again, who then takes some mud in his hand, he blows into it, and it flies up into the air. Now, I don't recall that anywhere in the biblical account. There's nothing in the Gospels that talk about this story. But we do find the very same story in the Thomas's Gospel, the infancy of Jesus Christ, which says, then he took from the bank of the stream some soft clay and formed out of it 12 sparrows. Then Jesus clapped together the palms of his hand, called to the sparrows and said to them, go, fly away. So in that, the only difference is where in one case he breathes into it, the other case he claps his hand and they fly away. But in both cases, Jesus, or in the case of Isa, or Jesus as a infant, is able to create birds out of nothing, both from the clay of the riverbed. So fascinating. You can see that's the source. Thomas's Gospel, infancy of Jesus Christ, that's a 2nd century. It is a Gnostic gospel. It is never considered to be authoritative. It was written long after the Gospels had all been written. It was never, ever part of the canonical story, even the canonical discussion. So you can see then why whoever wrote the Quran, we know it wasn't Muhammad, whoever took this account rather than going back to the biblical account. And for the same reason, again, because the New Testament was not translated into Arabic until the late 8th century.
Just to point out something in this story, even though story which has been created in 2nd century end up into eternal word of Allah, which tells us how Jesus creates bird with his breath out of the clay, even that like unhistorical or uncanonical story tells us something about the power Jesus has in his breath that can give life to the something which has been fashioned from the mud. Breath of Jesus is that powerful. Even the Islamic Jesus, that powerful, can give life. And if you compare this story with how Allah creates Adam and Eve, you can come to the conclusion Allah is much, much slower than Islamic Jesus, because Islamic Jesus just creates the bird, breathes into the bird, gives life, and birds fly away, versus it takes whole afternoon for Allah to try to create poor Adam and give life to Adam, and poor Adam says like, finish me before it gets dark. Even this stolen story which has been put into the eternal word of Allah shows us Islamic Jesus is much, much better than God of Islam.
Well, I would suggest that the reason for that is this was the very first time that God created Adam and Eve. He didn't know what he was doing, obviously, in the Quranic material, and that's why it took him all afternoon to get Adam down. By the time Jesus comes onto the scene, or Isa comes onto the scene 2,000 years ago, Jesus was now much quicker because God had now told him. This is the comeback that that they'll probably say, and that's much quicker.
Just a moment, Jay. Just a moment. Allah is the one who is all wise and all knowing. He didn't know how to put together the first man. He didn't know how he needed to make that quick. Versus Jesus, according to Islam, is according to Muslims, just the creation of Allah, simply has a power, even in his breath, to give life and quicker than Allah.
Devil's advocate here. I would agree with you. It does look like Jesus is quicker than Allah. And the only way that I can find any example, any excuse, is because they had a few thousand years to get it right, to quicken up their miraculous ability. Now let's go on and look. Let's just finish off with these ones here. Go up there, take a look at these here. These are further borrowed Jewish and Christian sources. In chapter 2, 102, the angel Harut and Marut are from the Midrash Yalzut, chapter 44. The raising Mount Sinai over the heads of the Jews is from the Abu Sara in the 2nd century account. That's a Jewish account. In chapter 15, verse 43 to 44, and chapter 17, verse 44, the 7 heavens and the 7 hells, that comes from the traditions of Jagiga and Zuhal. In chapter 17, verse 1, the Miraj and the Burak, the winged horse, that comes from the Testament of Abraham, 200 BC. Chapter 18, verse 9 to 25, the cave of the 7 sleepers. That's the story of the martyrs from Gregory of Tours and Diogenes Laertius. That's from the 3rd or 4th century AD. The Surah 19, I 71, the Sirat bridge is from the Shinabad, from the Zoroastrian book of Dinkart, which is a Persian book, which is fascinating because that comes from the Persian annals. In chapter 42 of the Quran, verse 17, and also chapter 101, verse 6 to 9, the story of the scale and the balances used on Judgment Day. That comes from the Testament of Abraham from 200 BC. The Surah 55, verse 56 and 58, and also chapter 56, verse 22 to 24, and verse 35 to 37. When you look at paradise, especially in the Quran, these huris that refers to over and over again, these women, these perpetual virgin women with large eyes and large breasts, these are huris. Even the word huris come from the Zoroastrian writings about the Padis. And you can see these are borrowings almost exactly back and forth. So most of these borrowings were written between the 2nd to 5th century AD, thus long after the Bible was canonized, suggesting that the creators of the Quran borrowed the wrong material.
So there is a comment comes from Mr. Rambo 7. Islam, sorry Jay, this has nothing to do with the topic, but about Jesus. Islam uplifts Jesus. Jesus as God is adultery, and Trinity is polytheism of three gods. Jesus never died and will return. Judaism is against Christianity. So, first of all, Islam does not uplift Jesus. Islam doesn't even understand who Jesus is. I'm sorry that I stand here as a Christian woman. I need to give you the basic theology about your ideology. Islam steps in and then introduces another one called Isa, which kind of translated as Jesus, and he has nothing to do with the biblical Jesus. Jesus as God-man, and you identify Trinity as a polytheism. I am sorry that all goes to the knowledge of Allah. Allah, all-knowing, all-wise Allah, alongside of Muhammad, who's supposed to be the best example to mankind, doesn't even know what Christian doctrine teaches. That is just shame on Allah and Muhammad. I can't do much about it. Jesus never died and he will return. Isn't that amazing that in somehow Allah didn't want Jesus to die, Allah didn't want Jesus to suffer, versus Allah was willing to watch Muhammad to suffer. Aisha says, I never seen anyone suffer as much as Muhammad. While Jesus is alive and with Allah, Muhammad is dead. I think that all explains itself. But can I just gently encourage Mr. Rambo 7, please do check your Islamic sources to kind of just figure out what Islam teaches about the basics. I think you need to start from the basics and then you need to take baby steps for that. Sorry, Jay. I'm just trying to keep eye on the chat to see if anyone has any rebuttal or any comments on why non-historical and non-inspired stories takes place in the eternal word of Allah, and with the heartbroken version of Mitalsia, sadly Muslims are silent.
Okay, now listen, we need to end off, and let me end off with bring this all to a conclusion so we get this done within 1 hour. And I'm going to go back to the Quran, and I'm going to go back to chapter 2, verse 79 in the Quran, which Muslims always claim is a verse that shows that the Bible is corrupted, without realizing if they're going to use chapter 2, verse 79, we're going to flip this around and put it right back in their laps. So if you open up to chapter 2, verse 79 of your Quran, it says this: then woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say, this is from Allah, to purchase with it a little price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they earn. So this is about the Jews, right? Because if you look earlier, it's talking about the Jews. Woe to those Jews who write with who write the book with their own hands and then say, this is from Allah. Now, if that's all you're going to read, that would be a pretty damning indictment against the Jews for writing something with their own hands and then saying this is from God. You need to read the verse preceding it, verse 78. Let's read that along with verse 79 and let's put it into context. All right, so let's go back to verse 78, chapter 2, verse 78. And there are among them, the Jews, unlettered people. Okay, unlettered people. That means they don't have scripture. Who know not the book. That means they don't know the Bible. Because the Jews, the book is the Bible. Am I correct, Hatun?
Yeah, I feel this verse is all talking about is Muhammad and Islam, but continue.
Here we go. Let's continue on. You're going to see how it's actually going to flip back and actually it's going to be an own goal. All right, but let's continue on. So let's put it in context. It says, and there are among them, the Jews, unlettered people, who know not the book. That means they don't know the Bible. So this has nothing to do with the Bible. They but trust, who know not the book, they but trust upon false desires, and they but guess. So here they are, they don't know the book, they don't know the Bible, they are not lettered. That means they're not even well educated. They don't have the Bible. They trust in false desires. That means they have a bad intent, and they but guess. They're guessing here. Then read verse 79. Then woe to those Jews who write the book with their own hands and then say this is from Allah. So what this is saying here is be careful of those Jews. They don't know the Bible. They are unlettered. They're not very clever. They are not well educated. They trust their own desires. They but guess. They write this, what they think is the book, and then they call it the book, or they say this is from God. What's that referring to? Who do you think that's all about? Well, obviously,
Muhammad.
Not Muhammad. Not Muhammad. I would say these are the Apocryphal writings. These are the Apocryphal writings it's referring to. It's saying be careful of those writings by the Jews, which is not from the book. Be careful of that which they guess and write with their own hands, which is not the book, but they call it the book. This is really the Mishnah in the Talmud. It's saying be careful of the Talmud. Be careful of the Mishnah. Be careful of these things that the Jews are writing with their own hands. They're not very clever people. They don't even have the Bible. They're not even look at the Bible. They're writing their own stories and then they're calling it the book, which is fascinating because what chapter 2, verse 78 and 79 are doing, it's telling Muslims not to trust these stories. Basically, it's saying, do not trust. Chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. Do not trust. Chapter 21, verse 51 to 71, the story of Abraham. Do not trust. Chapter 27, verse 17 to 44, the story of Solomon and Sheba. Because these are nothing more than made-up fables written by the Jews. They write it with their own hands, and then they call it book. Do not trust. Chapter 19, the story of Isa with Mary. Do not trust. Chapter 3, verse 49, of Isa making birds out of clay, because these are nothing more than Jews and Christians who are writing with their own hands. They are not talking about the Bible here. They're writing with their own hands, and they're saying it is from God. Basically, what chapter 2, verse 78 and 79 are saying is, don't trust the Quran. It's an own goal. They're actually shooting themselves in the foot. And that's why when Muslims bring this up, whenever they bring up chapter 2, verse 78 and 79, I say, yes, exactly. In other words, it's saying, do not even trust this book because it's written, it is borrowed from Jews, it's borrowed from Christians who were not people that read the Bible. They didn't even have the Bible in their hands. They wrote these stories outside of the Bible. They passed them on at firesides to the Arabs that they were talking to, the ones they were trading with. They gave them to their children as bedside tables, as nothing more than fairy tales. And these are the ones that the Gnostics wrote because they did not like the Gospels. They did not like the person of Jesus Christ as God. And so they wrote all these stories about his childhood that are fables, that are nothing more. That's why those stories are written much too late. They were never considered to be authoritative. They were not part of the New Testament. They were not part of the Old Testament. And yet those stories find their way into the Quran because those who put together the Quran were not disciplined enough. They did not know what they were borrowing. Be careful what you borrow. Woe to you, Muslims, when you borrow stories from the Jews that are not the book, but are written by the Jews who do nothing more than guess and call it the book. Be careful what you borrow. If you're going to borrow anything, for heaven's sakes, come back to the original book. Come back to this book. How many times have we said this, Hatu? always, always come back to the Bible, because these are the right stories. These are the historical account. These stories did happen. We can trust them. We know who Abraham was. We know who Moses was. We know who David was. We know who Adam and Eve were. We know the real story of Cain and Abel. We know that none of these stories here are in that, except for some stories about Moses. Otherwise, almost all the other ones are fictitious. They were written by much later scribes and people who are not interested in writing the Bible, because the Bible had already been finished, had already been canonized. Therefore, they could not write the Bible. They were nothing more than folk tales.
Sadly, it has been another disappointing night. It wasn't only disappointing to see that while author of the Quran puts the stories into the Quran and pretends that they are the word of Allah, yet we can figure out when were those stories were put together, timeline, and by whom. But it is disappointing and heartbreaking to see, actually, while in Surah 2 verse 28 and 29, Allah is warning the Muslim community, Muhammad failed to follow those warnings and put up those stories and add into the Quran. I think that's just sad. That's just sad.
Now, Hatu, there's a good question that's just come up that I'd like to answer. It's by Abbas Agha, who says, Jay, tell us what is the criteria required to select a book to add in the Bible? And we know this. This is the book of canonicity, the canonization of the what was considered. There were 5 criteria that were used, and I'm going to talk about the New Testament canon rather than the Old Testament. For the New Testament, number 1, you had to have, it either had to be written by an apostle or someone who was, number 2, who was writing at the same time that Jesus either lived or in the same century he lived, who either knew Jesus or knew those who knew Jesus. Number 3, it had to be written in the same area that Jesus lived and also ministered. Number 4, it had to be accepted by all of the churches. That you had to have a unanimous decision. You cannot have 95% of the churches accept one book, and then only one church has a completely different book, or 1 or 2 churches have a different book, and there cannot be any contradiction between the New Testament. So you don't have any contradictions between the gospel accounts and all those that come after. So these were the criteria that were used, and that's why there was 2 or 3 others. Another one was it had to change lives. Now, that's the process that was used to choose which books were considered to be of the 27 that were then included in the New Testament. These were all agreed upon within the 1st and early 2nd century. Muslims claimed that these were only agreed upon at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. No, they were not. This was not decided in the 4th century. The only reason those 27 books were listed there is because when you had the arguments by Athanasius against what's his name, the heretic.
Just before we go through all those details, let me just make a point, Jay. I think it is just, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but there needs to be like another word, which I don't know what it is, Muslims are asking this question because doesn't matter how the Bible is put together for the Muslims. Doesn't matter who are the author of which book of the Bible for Muslims, because Allah steps in 7th century alongside of Muhammad and confirms the 7th century Bible I have. And today we can go much, much earlier and then see what is the earliest compiled Bible or canonized Bible. But Muslims, you are not in any place to ask such a question. Jay is very kind that he's answering your question, but remember, you are not in any place to ask such a question. Allah doesn't have any problem with the Bible. Muhammad doesn't have any problem with the Bible, yet you do have a problem with the Bible. You are asking about the canonization of the Bible. I wonder, how did Quran go through the canonization of the Quran? I wonder who is the author or the first hearer of the Surah 4 verse 157. And Answer is zero. You have zero answer for those basic questions.
Well, I think, though, Hatun, it is okay for him to ask this question. It's also, I would like to ask the same question of the Quran. How is the Quran canonized?
No,
the verses in the Quran.
Jay, just a moment. It's not okay for him to ask this question because he identifies himself as a Muslim. We do not want Muslims to go against the teachings of Islam and become an apostate. That's what they are doing. They are going against Allah and against Quran and becoming apostate by asking such a silly questions. But anyway, please do continue, Jay. Sometimes I just get like
what you're doing, and you're being very clever, and I see why. It's very good that you're doing this. You're saying, Cheshma, look, Muslims, just go back to chapter 10, verse 94 of your Quran. Go back to 21, verse 7 of your Quran. And go back to chapter 4, verse 136. And specifically go back to chapter 5, verse 36 and 37, and also verse 68. When you look at those verses, you will find that in every case, it tells you to come back to the Bible. It tells you not to argue. In chapter 29, verse 46, don't even argue with us on this. It says in chapter 4, verse 136, that God gave both books, both the earlier scriptures and the Quran to you. So if this is the case, then you have no reason to even ask how it was put together, because already, as Hatun is saying, that Allah has accepted it, the Quran has accepted it, Muhammad has accepted it. Everybody up until the 11th century. Only in the 11th century, in 1056, was there any notion that the Old and the New Testament were corrupted. There is no reference earlier than 1056 by Ibn Hazm that there is a corruption of earlier scripture. That's 400 years after the Quran, 400 years after Muhammad. So Hatun is correct. You have no right to ask this question. Nonetheless, if you're going to ask this question, which you have done, then I would ask the same question of you. We've shown you how the early church did canonize the New Testament. How did the Quran get canonized? And why is it that these verses that we just talked about, chapter 21, verse 51 to 71, chapter 27, verse 17 to 44, chapter 5, verse 31 and 32, why were not these verses excised? Why were they accepted in the canon of the Quran when you know that these verses are borrowed from apocryphal literature? Why didn't anybody know that? They should have known that, because by the 7th century, this was well known. These were all around by the 7th and 8th and 9th century when the Quran was put together. More than that, who then decided how your Quran was put together? We don't know of any canonical, we don't even have one complete Quran at all from the 7th century. We've been asking you Muslims for a complete Quran by the 8th century. You still cannot come on. Even Mansur Ahmad admitted that you only had 96 to 97% of the Quran by 721. That's almost 100 years after Muhammad died. You still don't have a complete Quran. You only can find 96 to 97% of it. And that comes from 63 different Qurans, different pieces, fragments that he has never looked at, nor have anybody looked at to see if they even agree. So when was your book canonized? If you're going to ask us when our book was canonized, it was canonized by the 1st century. It was already well understood and accepted by the 1st century. This book that we have in our hand today was finally canonized in 1924. That is only 95 years ago. So Muslims, be careful what you ask. It's going to come back and it's going to boomerang right back on you. But can you see then why we need to make sure this goes public? Why we need to make sure that Muslims hear that the questions they're asking, not only, as Hatun says, do you have a right to ask that question because you're confronting your Quran, you're confronting Allah, you're confronting your prophet, but we as Christians are the only ones that can answer that question, because we're not confronting anybody or anything by asking and saying, why is it and how is it we can trust the 27 books that are in the New Testament and the 36 that are in the Old? We can trust it because those who knew Jesus Christ were the ones that wrote it. Those who knew and were inspired by the Holy Spirit were the ones that wrote the Old Testament. More than that, we also have applied the historical test, which we haven't done today, and we don't have time to do that. But at least we can answer that question. Muslims, let's see you answer the same question.
Let me ask you last question. And the question is, sorry, picture is too small, screenshot. Jay, have you thought of writing an upcoming book with the material that you know? I'm a big fan of yours and I admire the work you and all the effort you put in. That comes from false religion and cults are from hell. So when is your book coming up?
Well, Hatun, and I will say this, and people need to know this, because this is one of those little held secrets that people don't realize. Every time I put up a video on Fander Films, which is my YouTube site, YouTube allows every one of those putting up a video a description of that video, and they give us between 800 to 900 words. If you look at all my videos, take a look at every one of my videos and look at the descriptions. Most people don't even bother to do that because they don't even open up that box. That is a synopsis of everything that's on that video. Everything is being written out as we speak. Now, before I even do a video, before I ever put up a video on Fander Films, I've already written it out. I only have to write it once. That's on my computer right here. From that, I take a synopsis of everything. Then I do the video itself. I write out what I'm going to say. Then I do the video. And once the video is done, and remember the videos are only between 5 and 10 minutes. Once the video is done, I do a synopsis of that description, and that's in the description box. So if you want to know if you want to see something that is written about what we're putting up there, everything that goes up there, including all these new videos that we're just putting up now, with Al-Fadi and I going through Dan Brubaker's 20 corrections of the Quran, all the descriptions are there. You can pull those descriptions down, create your own book. Also, because of that, everything that we're saying in the video is in those synopses, is in those descriptions. So you don't have to re-look at the video to get what we're saying. Just pull those down, have your save them on your computer, and then you have access to them. Because in every one of those descriptions are every one of the references that we're using. The only thing I have not put in those descriptions are this: I do not put footnotes, because you cannot put footnotes in YouTube. They don't allow you they don't have ways of doing that. So please, folks, read the description. Everything you want, everything we're putting up, everything I'm saying is in the descriptions. They're almost all 800 words long. I fill up every one. I go right to this as much as I can allowed to do so for your sake, because I want you people to read this. I want you people to retain this. I want you people to assimilate it. I want you Muslims to be agitated by it, get angry. Listen, we know you're going to get angry by what you're reading, but everything we do, we source. Everything we say, we've researched, and everything that goes up there is written down. So that if you don't like the video, if you do not know where to look and find out where I've said, or what Hatun has said, or what Al-Fadi has said, because we all work together, the three of us, go and read the description. That's as long as you need to do.
So I think you didn't answer my question. So the question was, have you thought about writing the book, and when is it coming up? So
okay, now the second
question wasn't answered. You just
I will answer right now. Every one of those descriptions is going into a book. I'm in the moment writing 5 books as we speak. Okay. Every one of them is going to be published, but they're not going to be published until I'm ready, and they're not going to be published until the publishers are ready. What we need to make sure is that they get out there immediately. The immediate answer is they're already there. You can read them for yourself. The long-term answer: hold on, we will get this all published, and this will be available to you once I get it to the publisher, and then they print it up.
Okay, so we will keep eye on those things. And Jay, sadly,
I want to ask the same question of you, Hatun. When are you going to print up your books?
After I make a time to brush my hair. So thank you very much for helping us with tonight's material. I'm sorry that we didn't have Muslims who were able to deal the material, but that become their kind of common lifestyle. They are never able to deal with the material. But it has been another evening which we saw, while Quran is identified as the eternal word of Allah from 2nd century to 5th century, how human beings helped out the author of the Quran to put the certain stories. So that says a lot about the creation of the Quran. And we are grateful that we had Jay here to unpack this for us. So video will be up on YouTube, I think within 10-15 minutes after we finish the live stream. So feel free to use the materials. And also Muslims, if any of you are watching, some of you are watching, I can see from the chat, feel free to email in and we can schedule debate. for you to just defend the material or explain it to us. So you can do that through info@dcciministries.com, and we can give you more time if you were struggling to write all your responses and there wasn't enough time or enough character letters on the YouTube chat part. So you can do that as well. Jay?
Yes. Yeah.
So I am very grateful that you make a time for us again, and you helped us to learn something more and more every time when you come to the program. So we are grateful for that. Thank you very much.
Hatun, listen, it's been terrific being with you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry that I did not know about this earlier. I should have prepared a little bit better. Nonetheless, I think we had a good discussion on it. I am watching the chats, and quite a few people are saying, Hatun, you need to write your own book. You are coming up with such good material. Week after week after week down at Speaker's Corner, this needs to be written up. I would encourage you to do what I'm doing, Hatun, to every time you put up a video, put and write it out in the description.
Okay, so
now she's obviously trying to wait.
Saying all those kind of things.
She doesn't want to answer this. So the rest of you, encourage Hatun to write her own book. She needs to write many books because you're coming up with a lot of good research. Now, I think the next time we're getting together, Hatun, we're going to look at some historical anachronisms. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So the next time we get together, we'll be looking at historical anachronisms, looking and seeing how a lot of the stories in this book just make no sense historically. This is something that many Muslims are not aware of. Probably many of you who are Christians or those who are non-believers are not aware that a lot of this book, because it was borrowed from other sources, they made an awful lot of errors in what they borrowed. And we're going to look at some of those. We're not going to look at a lot of them because this could go on for long periods. But we're going to look at some of those historical anachronisms. We're going to unpack them for you and show how damaging this does. Because if these stories don't make sense for the person in that place doing that thing at that time, then this suggests that this is all man-made. Only men can make errors like that, not God. So this would be another nail in the coffin of the Quran, proving that it does not come from God. It did not come from Muhammad. It didn't even come from Uthman. It was written by other men, sourced and borrowed from other sources, and those sources were in the wrong date, the wrong time, in the wrong place. That's more for the next time. Good to see you again. Thanks, Hatun. I'll say good night to you because it's now well after 11 o'clock, almost 11:20 your time. It's only 6:20 my time. God bless you. It's been great working with you once again, as ever. Can't wait to see you in about a month and a half. This is Jayden, over and out.
Thank you very much, Jay. And also thank you very much for those of you who engaged with us on chat. And thank you very much for the admin for all your amazing work. As I said, if anyone felt that you didn't have enough time to do your rebuttal, please feel free to email info@dcciministries.com, and then we can take over from there and arrange debate with you, with Jay or anyone else if you prefer. And God bless you all, and we look forward to seeing you at Speaker's Corner or another live stream.